पाकिस्तान के खिलाफ बहुत सारे महाज खुले, कुछ हमने खुद खोले और काफी सारे हमारे खिलाफ खोले गए। आज के महाज
Good morning, good afternoon, and a very good evening to you wherever you may be. My name is Wajahat Saeed Khan. I'm an independent journalist based here in New York City, returning back with the foreign policy briefing that we usually do. We've been intermittent and irregular, but that's stopping because South Asia is back on everybody's radar right now. It's been a heady week in Pakistan where the military and other security forces components have cracked down in one of the deadliest incidents of cracking down on political protests in recent memory. The waves that have been created have produced ripples from Islamabad, where the crackdown happened, where 12 were killed, all the way here in New York City, where I am, where protests are still ongoing. The Pakistani diaspora is organizing. Just yesterday, I was invited to the Connecticut State Legislature to give a briefing about what is being deemed as a massacre. How does this expose Pakistan's current political fiasco? What are the implications here in the US and elsewhere? We're going to talk about that. Then Bangladesh versus India. There are tensions brewing. What's happening there? They were supposed to be close, but no longer. There's been a regime change of sorts in Bangladesh, and the Indians are quite wary. We're going to talk about the deteriorating tensions over there. And then Nepal versus India versus China. The Nepalese Prime Minister, Oli, is in China meeting Xi Jinping. He's leading a huge delegation. What does this mean for this interesting balancing act that Kathmandu has tried for decades now in making sure that the two biggest neighbors of Nepal, China and India, are happy? I can't obviously take care of all of these questions alone, and I am joined by my South Asia Wala wingman, Michael Kugelman, the director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center, to weigh in. We're going to be doing this on a weekly basis with Mike, who I welcome back because Mike writes the weekly foreign policy magazine South Asia Brief. Mike is at Michael Kugelman on Twitter, and his briefing is a must-do, and in fact is the inspiration for this program. Mike, welcome back. How are you?
Thank you very much. Good to be here, and thank you as always for plugging this weekly column. Look forward to it.
All right, Mike. Let's start with your piece. You've called the protests being under the radar. That's your section in your foreign policy briefing, which is less covered, but still perhaps worth shedding some sunlight on as disinfectant. Now, you have said that Bushra Bibi, the former First Lady of Pakistan, lives a very private life. Nobody's ever really seen her face. And of course, Imran Khan's significant other, she has created her presence, created on the streets, within the party, and overall in the Pakistan polity, a sense that Khan does not trust PTI's leadership. I want you to weigh in on that. Can you expand on what Bushra Bibi's presence in these massive protests means?
I think that we could look to some of the accounts that we've seen over the last few days, including a profile of Bibi that was published by The Guardian, which quoted an aide of hers that essentially suggested that Khan wasn't comfortable, that other leaders would be willing to take the protests forward in ways that he would like, and that likely was a reason why this very unusual step was taken of having this extremely private individual suddenly leading from the front with these protests. I think that one could look at it in a different way as well. I mean, I know that Bibi is a bit controversial, and she's particularly controversial now, given that a lot of people within the party, the leaders and supporters as well, I believe, are unhappy with how things played out, with how she left so quickly and so on, along with other leaders that were there. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that this is actually a bit of a politically savvy move by Khan to have her out there, just because, she has a level of authenticity and credibility as given her relationship with Khan. She's Khan's wife. And it is, Khan is, of course, revered unconditionally by so much of the PTI base. And I think that for many, at least initially, seeing her out there leading from the front would have been seen as something very inspiring. It didn't end as well as Khan and Bibi and others would have liked it to, but I think I understand to an extent the appeal and also the way in which she could help promote mobilization goals of Khan and PTI.
Sure, that makes sense. But the words you used were Bibi's presence likely signals tensions between Khan and the other PTI leaders. Khan reportedly didn't trust others with fronting a protest that the government vowed to put down. Expand on that, please.
Well, I mean, look at what happened, right? I mean, many PTI leaders didn't show up at the protest and were criticized for it, and many of the rank and file were unhappy. And then others were there and left early. Of course, Bibi left early as well. But no, I think the fact that she was out there is a reflection of the crisis, the leadership crisis within PTI. The fact that Khan, so far as I understood, thought that it was he was willing to take that step because he apparently wasn't willing to trust that others could do the job. So he thought it was best to put his faith in someone that he clearly trusts a lot, that being his wife. And again, you see what's been playing out since this protest fell short. There seems to be a lot of dissension within the ranks, and Khan, I mean, his own reputation is still pristine in the eyes of the party, and I think many of the other leaders as well. But there seems to be this frustration at play. How did things go? How did things turn out the way they did? Why were the protests not sustained? Obviously, the most important thing was the tragedy of it, the fact that you did have several protesters that lost their lives. But looking back, I think that Bibi is really symbolic of the divides and the crisis within the party, particularly in terms of the leadership and the dynamics there.
Okay, let's talk about the tragedy itself. The definitive question, which people are still asking, is about how to categorize this. Is it a massacre? Is it a crackdown? Is it what my colleague Ryan Grimm of Dropside News calls a premeditated massacre? The numbers, of course, are all over the map. We saw as little as 6 claimed in the initial hours of the protest, but then soon after, as many as 300 killed. So far, the numbers have percolated down to 12 confirmed killings, but the PTI is qualifying that by saying, well, those are only the confirmed killings. There's corpses missing. There's people incarcerated. Bodies may have disappeared. The hospitals have been suppressed from releasing data. What are you hearing? How do you categorize this, and which numbers do you believe? How should we see these numbers? How should we categorize this incident?
Well, I mean, one lost life is too many. But let me say this: I have no reason to think, based on my understanding of what played out, I have no reason to think there was a massacre. We know that there are several confirmed deaths that Indian media, Freudian slip, independent media have put out there, as well as a number of other trusted accounts on my part. It's clear that some people died, peaceful protesters died. But I think linked to that is another unknown, not just how many people died in this crackdown. And it was a crackdown, because what we do know is that hundreds of arrests were made, and also tear gas and rubber bullets were used against the protesters. But another thing we don't know is, were live bullets used? And I know that PTI has argued that this was the case. The government has completely denied this was the case. If you look at the death records and things like that, it's not completely clear. I saw an account of someone who lost their life because they were an asthmatic and they were tear gassed, and that caused them to die. So, you can't attribute that to live bullets. But, then again, there had been accounts from outlets like Al Jazeera, reporters that were there at the protest and said that they heard live fire, so to speak. There's a lot of unknowns. I think that, unfortunately, it's very sad that it's come to this, but human lives have become a political hot potato. I think that the government has been very evasive. It has not been truthful on some levels. I think it's not truthful when it says that there were no deaths. I think it's quite clear there were some deaths. But PTI, I would argue that PTI has also not been completely truthful, and this might be a reflection of the dissension within the ranks and the lack, the lack of one voice here, particularly with Khan in jail. Yeah, so many different accounts of how many people died: 12, 100, 420. 420 people did not die. I don't know how many people died. In an ideal world, there would be an independent investigation for the sake of accountability, for the sake of closure, that would give the country and the world a better idea as to what happened when the lights went out on that Tuesday night. But I think, to my sense, bottom line is that people were killed. At least several people were killed. But we're not talking about a massacre. We're not talking about anything premeditated.
On that note, Mike, what is a massacre? Help me out here. Let's put our copy editor hats on. I mean, 100 years ago, well, almost 100 years ago, in Chicago, 1929, one of the most famous events in America's history, the Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago between it was a mob war, gangland war. 7 guys died. 7 guys, all bad guys, I'm assuming, right? But it was called the Valentine's Day Massacre. Newspapers at that time thought that 7 mobsters killing each other is a massacre.
Right.
And that became headline news. In fact, it's still referred to in the American imagination as a massacre. Mm-hmm. What is a massacre? 5, 10, 12, 500 is definitely a massacre. But where do we draw this line and sort of, because not calling it a massacre automatically gives a clean sheet to the security forces and people who did use live weapons. Now, the UN has been pretty clear about this: proportionality, use of live firearms, the need to protect life. But again, it's a slippery slope of a debate, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. But here again, we get to the issue of the unknowns. I think for me, when I think of a massacre, I do think of high levels of fatalities, in the dozens at least. I mean, you're right. The one that you described was, we're talking about 7 lost lives. Again, 1 is too many. But I also think not only in terms of high levels of fatalities, but I think of the most brutal, egregious levels of force being used. So what happened in Bangladesh this summer, right? When you had paramilitary forces opening fire from helicopters and shooting people in the head, that was a clear massacre. I mean, that's worse than a massacre. But with Pakistan, again, honestly, if you have security forces arresting people, if you have security forces tear gassing people, that's a nasty crackdown, but it's not a massacre. But if you have security forces opening fire, using live fire that kills people, even if we're just talking a few people, absolutely that would be a massacre. But my own view is I'm still not sure. I really don't know what this crackdown consisted of, if anything, beyond arrests, beyond rubber bullets, beyond tear gassing. But again, I'm not trying to justify even that type of use of force.
Well, it's not been transparent. And you can agree or disagree with Khan, but what the PTI now demanding sounds only fair, that an independent judicial investigation is conducted, which is not allowed right now. At least there's no talk of it right now, but that's what he's demanding. In fact, he's marching soon again in Peshawar to demand that. Otherwise, he might even consider civil disobedience. That's a whole other story. But let's bring it back to Rawalpindi, my favorite city, home of General Headquarters and the Pakistani Army. They've just met a few hours ago. They've come out with a press release, the Formation Commanders Conference. I'm assuming you've read it. What do you make of it? I thought there was a lot of flexing, no regret shown about the tragic events. We don't have to agree whether it's a massacre or not, but it was a tragedy in Pakistan's recent political history. That didn't come off as if the military thought of it that way or is seeing it that way. In fact, it's back to its old digital terrorism. This is from international elements. This is from vested interests. Same old from the Pakistan Army. What do you make of their latest and first comeback since this tragedy?
Yeah, well, it is unfortunate in the sense that the position of the government, which really reflects the civilian and military leadership, is that there was no tragedy, there were no deaths, and that people were acting illegally, and therefore it was right for the security forces to repel them and arrest them and push them back. So in that sense, it's not surprising that we got this messaging that we did. But you and I have been talking that we know that several people died in these protests. We don't know how many. We don't know under what circumstances. People did die, and I think that at the least one would hope that there could be expressions of regret, even if not apologies. But I don't think we're going to get that, just because that's not the official position. I think that the government and the state has been very consistent in its position, and that is that the other side was lying. There was no live bullets were used, no deaths. Let's move on.
Yeah. Do you think the army is doubling down, thick-skinned as usual, Mike? I mean, how do you see the strategy of moving on, back to business? What do you make of this approach?
Well, I actually do think that, quite frankly, the state has the upper hand now. I had said earlier on last week that Khan took a gamble by raising the stakes and making this final call, and he appeared to have won because you had large numbers of people that came out. But when you look at how things ended, the protests, quite frankly, did not achieve much at all, in my view. They ended almost as quickly as they started. You had this tragedy with this loss of life. And now, the party is in a bit of disarray, I would argue. Khan remains what he was, a powerful force, popular, and so on. But the party itself is in a bad place. And I think that the army, and I guess the government, broadly speaking, feels that it could simply move on. And I do think, I don't remember if I said this during our last conversation, I do think that the state might hope that this problem, so to speak, will take care of itself. The PTI will essentially wither away. I mean, there'll be so much of a crisis within the leadership ranks that won't be able to do much. You'll have so much frustration within the base that there won't be an appetite for protest, that Khan eventually will become increasingly isolated in jail. And even if he calls more people out to protest, won't get very far because there's not much of a leadership outside of jail. That might be the hope and the belief of the state. But again, that might overstate or that might underplay just how significant a player Khan remains. But for now, I do think that the state has the upper hand. And let's not forget, a lot of people in Pakistan are just very unhappy about the general state of play with the economy. And they don't want this political distraction. They just want things to get better. And many people were very unhappy about the blockades and the lockdown and all of that in Islamabad. That's an important factor that works to the benefit of the government too.
Well, I'm hearing that the army is starting to bicker, and that was one of the reasons that this formation commander conference was hurriedly called. But that's just one perspective. But Mike, putting a cap on this last question, and then we'll move on to India and Nepal and China and the rest of South Asia. Real quickly, the State Department has been mute as usual. Now, I know we've talked about this a dozen times or more, but this is now the end of days. They're in a transition phase. The Biden administration can at least do one good thing about Pakistan before it leaves and say, hey, what happened was, we don't have to call it a crackdown. We don't even have to call it a massacre. We can call it a tragedy. Not even that, nothing, not a whiff from the folks at the DOS. Why is Washington still mute when in its last days, perhaps it can do a little tip of the hat to Pakistan's democracy and polity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, there's just the issue of bandwidth, right? I mean, this, as you suggested, this is an administration that's preparing to transition to the next government here, and so there's just, I think, not much focus on Pakistan with everything else going on. But also, I do think, and I said this before, that ever since Cyphergate, so to speak, ever since the controversy involving the cipher and Donald Liu and all of that, that the State Department has concluded that it's just better to keep quiet, which I could completely understand. And I think it views this latest crisis as a domestic political crisis in Pakistan. That's what it was, and I think it feels better just to stay out of it. But I think there have been a few questions that journalists, I imagine Pakistani journalists, have asked the State Department spokesperson, and I think there was a brief response. You're right, there wasn't much to it, but I just think, quite frankly, I think the administration just wants to stay out of this and move on and focus on the transition and go from there.
Yeah, I understand how Washington's busy and the administration's in its lame duck phase and, it's packing its bags. But even the U.S. Embassy in Pakistan, which, by the way, not too many days ago, sent a press release about how it's worried about what's happening in Parachinar and Kurram. But there was no press release, nothing about what happened on D Chowk in Islamabad. I found that quite strange.
Yeah.
But anyways.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, Parachinar is, I think, can be seen as something that's goes much beyond a domestic political issue. It's a security crisis, and security considerations are always foremost on the minds of the U.S. And I'm sure that the U.S., which had recently issued that security warning about the Marina Hotel in Peshawar, warning Americans not to go there. I think this is what the U.S. is most concerned about: security risks. And again, it makes sense.
And thus they continue to work with the army. All right, let's pivot. Bangladesh versus India. Now they were tight for almost 2 decades. Sheikh Hasina very tight with one Indian administration after the other. Now that she's gone and a new government is in place there, we've seen a deterioration of the standards of diplomacy between Dhaka and New Delhi. Now, in your foreign policy brief, you state that things have been deteriorating, but there's been yet another dramatic development with the arrest of a Hindu Bangladeshi activist, and that this will have larger implications between Dhaka and New Delhi. Play this out for us. Talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old, which I clearly am when it comes to the other side of South Asia.
I'll do my best. It's a very complex issue. No, bottom line is that ever since Sheikh Hasina was left the country in August, she left a major vacuum that's been filled for the most part by actors that are very critical to, if not hostile to, India. So it was inevitable that there was going to be challenges for India in its relationship with Bangladesh. But indeed, what happened recently was very alarming for India, because you had this prominent Hindu monk in Bangladesh who, as I understand it, was charged with sedition for simply having staged a protest and raised a saffron flag above the Bangladeshi flag. To me, that doesn't sound like sedition. I can't imagine that the Bangladesh constitution would label it as such. This is, and so, India believes that this is just the latest case of Hindus being targeted unfairly in Bangladesh, which has been one of the biggest Indian concerns since Hasina's removal. It believes that there's been large numbers of attacks on the Hindu community, and indeed, independent Bangladeshi media investigations have found that there have been hundreds of attacks on religious minorities on the whole, including Hindus. Not all deadly attacks. Some of them have targeted Hindu businesses and so on. But so I think that for India, this is sort of like a last straw, that you have this Hindu activist charged with sedition, such a serious charge. He was denied bail, and then also, when he was denied bail, he got back in the bus outside the courthouse. A large number of his supporters, Hindu supporters, stood around the bus, trying to express solidarity with him. And at that point, according to Bangladeshi press accounts, you had a number of counter protesters, Muslims, who threw stones at the Hindu supporters of this activist. And then again, that sort of, for India, validates its view that Hindus are really under the gun. Then what happened very soon after that is that you had the Assistant High Commission in Tripura, city in India bordering Bangladesh. It was breached by a mob of angry Indians. And India's reaction to this was essentially, well, this was regrettable. No apology, no expression of concern. This got the Bangladesh government very angry. And so you've had high commissioners called in and so on. We're not talking about a huge crisis like what India has had with Canada, but this relationship, it's really in a free fall, which is remarkable because, as you noted, for so many years, this relationship was in a good place. And that's largely because of the Hasina factor. She was in power for such a long time. She really is very close to Modi. I would argue that Sheikh Hasina was very close to the Congress Party as well. She was very close to the Gandhi family. So this relationship between India and Bangladesh with Hasina, and really going back to her father, it's very long-standing. So it's a shock to the relationship with Hasina out of the scene.
Yeah, I'm wondering how Washington will weigh in. I'm watching Tulsi Gabbard's Twitter feed because she's weighed in about the targeting of minorities in the subcontinent, especially in Bangladesh of late, in this melee, this political melee which we've been seeing. But it'll be interesting to see how she weighs in, because that'll define partially where Washington goes with this, with the new administration. Last but not least, the Nepali Prime Minister is in China. 87-member delegation, balancing act, because his folks, his government is interested in the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, but he doesn't want to sign on very many big loans. Meanwhile, he also has local allies to worry about and the Indians to worry about. When I was reading your briefing, it reminded me of Pakistan's precarious position, where Pakistan has always worried about Washington and how Washington will weigh in about it coming on and signing on Chinese development programs. Are there parallels to be drawn here between Nepal and Pakistan, or are there differences?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Nepal has this very special relationship with India that goes back many years, but you have had periods over the last few decades, particularly the 4 times that the current Prime Minister, KP Oli, was in power, when you had a bit of an apparent tilt toward China, or not a tilt, but a desire to sort of move closer to China. And I argue in the piece that what we're seeing with Nepal and what we're seeing with Oli is actually a reflection of a broader trend in South Asia with a number of new leaders there, where they may appear to be, very pro-China, but they're not trying to jump into the Chinese camp. They're more just trying to exert more strategic autonomy. They're trying to better balance their relations with India and with China. And I think that's what Oli is trying to do. That said, his trip to Beijing was very significant because, there's been talk for years between Nepal and China about bringing BRI to Nepal, but it has not there are no BRI projects that have been implemented. They haven't moved forward. But during this trip, Oli signed a framework agreement for cooperation on BRI, and this is going to be concerning for India. India has been worried for quite some time that China has been growing out its influence there. There's been some credible reports that FP, not me with FP, but others with foreign policy, have written indicating that China has actually been meddling in the politics of Nepal to the point that it was able to help unite some of the leftist parties there, which helped them electorally and politically. And this is not what India wants, because those leftist parties tend to be more inclined to want to work with China. So India, as you know, rejects the Belt and Road Initiative, not because it's a Chinese project, but because in India's view, it's a violation of Indian sovereignty, because it encroaches on disputed territory that that India claims as its own. So, yeah.
Right. And last but not least, Mike, I know they're not in South Asia, but the South Koreans were almost pulled to Pakistan this week. In fact, they pulled it and then they pushed back and settled things down. I know that's not within your wheelhouse, but there were people in Pakistan who were a little elated. Some of these chaps are in uniform who were a little elated, saying, "Hey, we're on the right side of history." And then we saw what happened in Seoul a few hours later. Do you see overall in South Asia and Southeast Asia, you see a little bit of what we've seen in Bangladesh, what we're seeing in Pakistan, democratic backsliding with India, and of course, this fiasco in South Korea even. Let's not ignore the Myanmars of the world or the Thailands of the world. Do you see some sort of just general democratic backsliding ongoing in this region at large?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, democracy is on the retreat across much of the Indo-Pacific, across Asia, East Asia, South Asia, I mean, Central Asia as well. But I think that the South Korea story is actually, at the end of the day, a good sign for democracy. I mean, as you know, martial law didn't last long. Parliament voted to reject it right away. You had people coming out to protest en masse. And, some observers in Pakistan had said, well, had martial law been formally declared in Pakistan, it would not have been reversed after 2 hours.
Not by Parliament.
Exactly, definitely not by Parliament. So I think this is a good sign. And as you know, I mean, South Korea has a very dark history of dictatorship going back to the 80s, and I think it's actually quite inspiring to see so many people come out allergic to any whiff of a return of dictatorship. So I think it's very encouraging, and in that sense, it makes Pakistan look bad. I mean, there are plenty of people in Pakistan that think that informally Pakistan has been under martial law for quite some time. But at the end of the day, the military's political power remains quite dominant. That's not good for democracy. And even if Pakistan is not formally declaring martial law, there's still a lot of concerns about democracy in Pakistan, particularly because of the clout of the armed forces.
Well put, Mike. So the lesson learned here is beef bulgogi and not beef nihari. Thank you, Michael Kugelman, South Asia wala, probably the only guy in Washington who gets that joke. Take care, man. And I will see you next week after your next briefing.
I wonder how long. That was great. Good. Thank you. Always a pleasure.
All right. Talk soon.
Take care.